Back in the Bronze Age, a new breed of people began to rise in history from the lands of the Balkans. They were born from the mingling of local Balkan tribes with Indo-European newcomers who entered the Balkans. They were not a single nation, but a patchwork of tribes scattered across mountains, valleys, and coastlines. The Greeks and Romans called them Illyrian because they were a group of many tribes who never saw themselves as one. But the Illyrians were not just many tribes that lived together. They were enemies of Rome, and the journey of how they rose high enough to torment even the mighty Roman Empire is what we would uncover in this video. But before we dive further, subscribe to this channel if you want to explore more historical stories like this. The Illyrians lived in the harsh lands of the Western Balkans, where mountains carved the horizon and rocky soil tested every hand that tried to till it. It was not a land for ease. Archaeology traces their roots back to the Middle and Late Bronze Age, when communities began to take a different shape in the region. They had bent the land to their will by covering the hilltops with fortified settlements. Their societies grew sharper and more stratified. Chiefs rose above warriors, warriors above farmers, and together they carved out a distinct culture in the region. And by the 6th century BC, they had grown too visible to ignore. The Greek geographer Hecataeus of Miletus marked them on his maps, drawing their presence along the Adriatic coast as Illyrians. What began as scattered tribes now carried a name that echoed across the ancient Mediterranean. The Illyrians were an Indo-European-speaking group of tribes who lived as hill farmers and herders on a vast territory. Their lands extended from the Istrian Peninsula in the northwest to the Gulf of Arta in the south, and eastward into the Morava, Margus, and Vardar, Axius river valleys. And within this territory, the Illyrians lived together in large tribal groupings, such as the Dardanians in the interior highlands, modern Kosovo and southern Serbia, the Adriatic in the central Balkans, and the Dalmatians and Liburnians along the Adriatic coast of today's Croatia. Further south, the Taulanti, Ardeae, and Labeatai dominated the Albanian shores, while the Japidas and Pannonian tribes settled in the north. The Illyrians were everywhere, but never united. They lived together, but occupied different communities in the same region. But though they were scattered, they all tapped into the wealth of their homeland. They took timber from their forests, metals from their hills, and salt from coastal springs. These became the lifeblood of their survival. These were not just resources for themselves, but goods for trade exchanged with Greeks and others who eyed their lands from across the Adriatic. Illyria's rugged coastline stretched along the eastern Adriatic Sea, directly opposite the Greek islands. The land was beautiful, but it was harsh. Strabo, the ancient geographer, wrote that the mountains were rough and poor and not suited to a farming population. Although olives and vines grew well on the coasts, inland, the soil was thin and harsh, forcing the Illyrians to struggle with survival. And so, while some farmed, many Illyrians turned to cattle raiding, warfare, and eventually piracy as a way of life. Even their geography supported this lifestyle. The inland highlands, poor for agriculture, produced hardy herdsmen who became formidable warriors, while the coastline, with its countless inlets and islands, created natural bases for naval raiding. They also built light ships for their naval raids, especially the Limbus, a swift-oared galley, and its later variant, the Liburna. These were vessels designed to strike and vanish before an enemy could react. This was the world of the Illyrians, and from this world, this mosaic of tribes bound together by hardship, war, and the sea, greater stories begin to rise. In the 5th and 4th centuries B.C., Illyria was not a single nation, but a restless patchwork of tribes. Each tribe was a world of its own, ruled by chiefs, bound by tradition, and driven by the hunger for survival. Power was never inherited with crowns or thrones. It was earned through the clash of swords and the smoke of raiding. This diversity gave Illyrian warfare many faces. Some tribes struck inland, clashing with Macedonia and Epirus, while others hurled themselves against Greek ports on the Adriatic. The air in those years was never still. It always trembled with the movement of raiding parties, the pounding of hooves, and the smoke of burning villages. And then from among these restless tribes of Illyria, a man rose who made kings tremble. His name was Bardylis. He was a Dardanian warlord of the 4th century B.C. He united clans together with his iron will and promises of plunder and glory. His army was cunning and deadly, a blend of swift cavalry and fierce light infantry, cutting through enemies with terrifying skill. In 393 B.C., Bardylis thundered across the Balkans. He crushed the Macedonian king Amyntas III, grandfather of Alexander the Great, and forced the proud Macedonians to bow and pay tribute. The Macedonians were humiliated, while the Illyrians went home with triumph. But Bardylis was not finished. Years later, in 359 B.C., he struck again. He killed King Perdiccas III, Amyntas' son and Alexander's uncle, in battle. Thousands of Macedonian soldiers were also slain on the field. For a moment, the mighty land of Macedonia crumbled under Illyrian power. But Macedonia found a savior when Philip II, father of Alexander the Great, rose and turned their humiliation into vengeance. At first, Philip sought peace. He married Odata, Bardylis' granddaughter, in a fragile attempt to call a truce. But Philip was not the kind of man who remained in submission. He rebuilt his army and reshaped it into a disciplined phalanx of spears that moved as one body. And then, in 358 B.C., at the Battle of the Aragon Valley, Philip met Bardylis head-on in battle. The clash was brutal. 7,000 Illyrian warriors were killed, and the great Bardylis was defeated. The Dardanians lost their grip on Macedonia, but even in defeat, the Illyrians did not cease their raids. Macedonian rulers continued to struggle under the weight of Illyrian pressure. In 314 to 312 B.C., Cassander, one of Alexander's successors, marched into southern Illyria and seized ports like Apollonia and Epidamnus. He thought he could crush them with his victory, but the Taulanti, another Illyrian tribe led by their king Glaucius, struck back and reclaimed their lands. Through the years, Illyria was never silent. Though they were too divided to form an empire, they were still too fierce for the world to ignore. The Illyrians were never content with raiding only the lands of Macedonia. As the 4th century B.C. unfolded, their hunger turned toward the seas. Among the tribes, it was the Taulanti, the coastal Illyrians, who struck first. Twice their fury poured across the borders into Epirus, tearing into its fertile valleys in 385 B.C. and again in 360 BC. They attacked the proud Molossians, rulers of Epirus, cutting down many from the dynasty, the very family from which Pyrrhus, the great warlord, would later descend. But the Illyrians did not stop there. Their raids pressed down on the very lifelines of the Greeks. The wealthy colonies of Epidamnus, Apollonia, and Corcyra found themselves under constant threat of Illyrian sails. The people lived in fear of waking up to burning ships and smoke rising from the horizon. So they cried out for help from stronger powers like Corinth, Sparta, and Macedon, for they knew they could not withstand the Illyrian storm alone. But as the Greeks rallied their powers, the Illyrians changed their game, shifting from land to sea. By the early 3rd century BC, Illyrian raiding had transformed into piracy. They stopped merchants mid-voyage, seized their cargo, and demanded tribute as if the sea itself belonged to them. The Greeks called them pirates, but the Illyrians did not consider their action as piracy. To them, they were simply raiding as they used to. Only now, the sea was their battleground. Their weapon was the limbus, a small, nimble ship as sharp and quick as a striking hawk. One moment, the sea was calm. The next moment, it boiled with Illyrian war cries. By the time the Greeks gathered their forces, the lembi had already slipped away into shallow waters, their sails disappearing like shadows at sunset. And so, the Illyrians became famous across islands and seas. Greek sailors whispered of them in fear, telling stories of sudden, unpredictable attacks, burning decks, and shadows slipping away into the mist. The people who had once been raiders on land had become predators on the sea. And yet the storm was only just stirring. By the 3rd century BC, the restless Illyrian world gave birth to a new power, called the Ardii. At first no one feared them. They lived inland in the rocky valleys of what is now Bosnia. But slowly, the Ardii began to drift south toward the Adriatic coast of modern Montenegro and northern Albania. And there, they forged something no Illyrian tribe had ever achieved before, a kingdom. The land had everything they needed. They controlled fertile inland plains, guarded mountain passes and seaports that opened like gates onto the Adriatic. With both land and sea in their hands, they commanded resources no Illyrian tribe had ever possessed before. And with these resources, they built a navy. The navy turned the Adriatic into its hunting ground under the reign of King Agron. Ancient writers remembered him as one of the strongest rulers the Illyrians ever had. His fleet of lembi was the largest ever seen. When Agron's ships appeared, fear spread faster than the wind. His warriors swept down on Corcyra, Epidamnus, Pharos, striking like lightning and leaving smoke in their wake. But unlike the raids of old, Agron's men did not vanish after victory. They further conquered the lands. Garrisons were planted on captured ground, a warning to every Greek colony that Illyria was no longer a shadow, but a kingdom rising on the sea. And yet, at the very height of this power, Illyria's great king Agron fell in 231 BC. King Agron of Ardii died in 231 BC. Ancient writers stated that he died suddenly from excessive drinking. His sudden death left a kingdom at its peak without a king strong enough to hold the throne. So, the crown was passed into the hands of his widow, Queen Teuta. She ruled as regent on behalf of the young Prince Penis, Agron's son by his first wife, Teuta. Teuta was an unyielding and fierce woman. From the moment she took power, she unleashed her will upon the waves. She ordered her commanders to treat all neighbors as enemies. Her voice was like a storm wind over the Adriatic, unleashing ships that prowled the waters like wolves in search of prey. Under her rule, piracy was no longer just tolerated. It was a royal policy. The Adriatic became Teuta's hunting ground. In 231 BC, the Illyrian sails spread far and wide across the western Peloponnese, striking Elis and Messenia. On their way home, they descended on Phoenice, the proud city of Epirus, stripping it bare. The Greeks looked on in disbelief. Never before had pirates traveled over 1,000 miles to raid their lands, daring to plunder cities they once thought were safe. To the Illyrians, it was not mere piracy. It was a message that no city, no coast, no sea was safe from Teuta's reach. But for Teuta, this was only the beginning. By 229 BC, she sent forth her ships once again, their sails blotting out the horizon. Epidamnus, today's Duras, fell after a bloody resistance, and its stores were plundered. From there, the fleet known as Armada turned on Corcyra, the jewel of the Ionian Sea. Its leaders cried for help, sending desperate pleas across the sea. The Achaean League and its allies answered their pleas, but before they could rescue the city, the Illyrians crushed them. So, Corcyra surrendered and opened its gates to Teuta's men. She placed her loyal nobleman, Demetrius of Pharos, as garrison commander over them. Seeing what had happened to Corcyra, Apollonia trembled and sought protection from Rome. Apollonia declared itself a friend of Rome, a decision that altered history forever. Rome could not ignore the cries of its new friends. The Adriatic was their lifeline, their artery of trade and influence. Teuta's sails threatened not just Greek merchants, but Rome's future. So the Roman Senate rose to act, and for the first time in its history, Rome would send a great army beyond Italy. 2 consuls led the campaign, Gnaeus Fulvius Centumalus, a master of the seas, and Lucius Postumius Albinus, a patrician general. Together, they commanded a fleet of 200 warships and 20,000 infantry. Their mission was to free the Greeks, secure the sea, and break the pride of Teuta. Fulvius struck first at Corcyra in 229 BC. Demetrius of Pharos had betrayed Teuta by opening Corcyra's gates to the Romans in the dead of night. The Illyrian garrison was expelled from the city, and Rome was welcomed as protector. At the same time, Postumius marched into Apollonia. The city welcomed him without resistance, and an alliance was forged. Northward, the Roman forces advanced to Epidamnus. The Illyrian garrison abandoned the city in haste without a fight. One by one, cities and tribes fell into Rome's embrace. But the fight was not over. Far north, the island city of Issa still suffered under siege. So, Fulvius's fleet sailed to their rescue, and at the sight of Rome's navy, the Illyrians broke. They scattered, abandoning the blockade. Issa was freed and placed under Rome's protection. Teuta's reign of terror was intercepted. With Roman warships dominating the coast and her enemies multiplying, she retreated to her capital at Rizon, modern Rizon, Montenegro. Her war was over before she could even strike back. In 228 BC, Teuta was forced into peace. She was stripped of her conquests on the Greek coast. She was left with only her northern strongholds around Rizon. Demetrius of Pharos, once her loyal servant, was rewarded by Rome with lands near her island. Worst of all, Illyrian piracy was shackled. No ship from her realm could sail south of Lissus with more than 2 armed vessels. The Greeks cheered Rome's victory. Their seas were safe again and their cities were freed. But the true victor was Rome. The First Illyrian War was not just a struggle of pirates and soldiers. It was Rome's grand entrance into the wider stage of the Eastern Mediterranean. For the first time, the Republic had tasted power beyond Italy, and the world would never be the same. After the First Illyrian War, Queen Teuta faded into the shadows. Her stepson, Pinnes, inherited the crown. But he inherited only a trinket of power. The true power now rested in the hands of Demetrius of Pharos, the ambitious noble who had once betrayed Teuta to Rome. Demetrius moved quickly to bind the dynasty to his own cause. He married Teuta, Agron's widow and mother of young Pin, making himself regent. For a while, he played the role of Rome's faithful ally. He sent Illyrian troops to fight alongside King Antigonus of Macedon at the Battle of Silesia in 222 BCE. He even captured Demalum, a fortress in central Illyria, and held it under Rome's name. On the surface, he was loyal to Rome. But beneath the mask, ambition burned like a hidden fire. By 220 BCE, the mask slipped. Demetrius broke away from Rome's treaty. Together with Scerdylitus, a fierce Illyrian chieftain, he built a fleet of 90 limbi. The treaty allowed only 2, but Demetrius raised 90. Their first strike was on Pylos in Messenia. In one thunderous raid, they seized 50 ships. And once again, the Illyrian name spread terror across harbors and islands of Greece. Though Scerdylitus soon withdrew north, Demetrius pressed deeper into the Cyclades, displacing Rome's allies and lighting the coasts with fire. At this, Rome's patience snapped. In 219 BCE, the consuls Lucius Aemilius Paulus and Marcus Livius Salinator crossed the Adriatic with a storm of men and ships. They struck first at Demalum, Demetrius's prized fortress. The siege lasted only a week before Roman soldiers broke down its defenses. They tore through the walls and slaughtered the garrison. From there, the legions advanced to Pharos, Demetrius's stronghold. The Romans struck at the island with one cunning act. One force attacked loudly at the gates, drawing the defenders to the gates. Meanwhile, another Roman force slipped unseen through a hidden path, scaling the walls. When the defenders rushed out to meet the diversion, they turned only to see Romans already inside their city. Pharos collapsed in flames, and in just 15 days, Rome shattered Illyria. With nothing left, Demetrius fled across the sea to Philip V of Macedon, abandoning the land he once ruled. Rome showed no mercy on the Illyrians. They destroyed Pharos's walls, reimposed the old treaty with harsher chains than before, and ensured Illyria would never again challenge the Adriatic. Pins remained a shadow king under Roman's watch. Scerdylitus was spared and made a Roman ally. The Second Illyrian War ended as quickly as it had begun. It was short, sharp, and final. Illyria's roar was reduced to a whimper, but the embers of rebellion were not completely wiped out. For a day came when a new Illyrian hand stirred those embers back into flame. For decades after the Second Illyrian War, Illyria remained under Rome's chains. The proud Ardeaean kingdom was broken and reduced to a shadow of what it once was. By the mid-2nd century BCE, the Ardeaean kingdom was confined to a small area around Scadra, the capital city of Ardeae. It was ruled by King Pleuratus III, who ruled cautiously under Rome's shadow. But when he died in 181 BCE, his son Gentius rose to the throne, and he became the last king Illyria would ever know. At first, Gentius followed his father's cautious path. But during the Third Macedonian War, when Rome declared war on King Perseus of Macedon, Genius found himself caught between giants. At first, in 171 BCE, Gentius sided with Rome. But by 169 BCE, Macedonian promises and the lure of silver turned Gentius against Rome. He allied with Perseus, sealing the pact by marrying the daughter of Manunius II of Dardania. With this marriage, he gained both a northern ally and the courage to defy Rome. Perseus promised him 300 talents of silver, and though only 10 ever reached him, the promise was enough to awaken Illyrian boldness within him. In 168 BCE, Gentius acted with fire. He seized 2 Roman envoys, accusing them of being spies. He rallied 15,000 men and a fleet of 270 limbi. His brother Caravantius struck at the Cavi. His ships raided Apollonia and Epidamnus, burning shores that had long resisted Illyrian power. For a brief moment, the Illyrians seemed reborn, fighting by land and sea, as in the glory days of Agron. But their glory was short-lived. Rome answered their rebellion swiftly and without mercy. The praetor Lucius Anicius Gallus crossed from Italy with his legions and allies. His fleet swept the Adriatic, seizing Illyrian ships before they could strike again. Gentius retreated back to Scadra, his capital, as panic spread through his army. Illyrian troops fled behind walls, refusing open battle. Gentius begged for 3 days, hoping Perseus would send aid, but no help came. Caravantius was already defeated. His fleet was destroyed, and his allies were gone. So Gentius surrendered. Ancient writers tell us that he fell to his knees, offering gifts and begging for mercy. At Meteon, Roman soldiers seized his queen, his brother, and his sons. His family was dragged away in chains. Gentius himself was carried to Rome and paraded through the streets in Anicius's triumph of 167 BCE. The last Illyrian king became a spectacle, and the Ardeaean kingdom was abolished. Cities like Issa were rewarded with Roman friendship. Towns that resisted like Pharos were destroyed. Illyria, once a terror of the seas, was now only a Roman frontier. And yet, the Illyrians did not vanish. They marched in Rome's legions, lived in Rome's provinces, and in centuries to come, Illyrian sons rose into power as rulers of Rome. Diocletian and Constantine the Great are both Roman emperors of Illyrian background. The storm that once raided the Adriatic was absorbed into Rome, reshaped and reborn within the republic it once defied. And for the people of Illyria, their independence ended in 168 BCE.